Maura McAdam, you are very welcome to the Lead Well podcast.
Thank you very much.
Great to have you here. I feel in a way that I'm actually going to walk away from today's episode with tons of new knowledge as well. Being an entrepreneur myself, it's really great to have you join me on the podcast. And I was thinking a nice place for us to start could be, because I think it's very relevant when we think of the political landscape at the moment as well. A recent paper, obviously, that's been published that is creating a nice bit of noise, let's say. And we're looking at, in particular, these venture accelerators. And we're looking at the topic of hegemonic masculinity and how these actually reinforce that. Could you tell our listeners a little bit about that research?
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose just a little bit of context. I have been researching incubators and accelerators for over 20 years and looking at them across many different geographies. That paper was set in the US. I think what's really interesting is to think about how incubators are and accelerators are designed and how they are, I suppose, programmed and the design around them, and who are they trying to suit and who are they trying to tailor and cater for. And a lot of my research has shown previously that they are embedded with masculinity and that the ideal tenant is male. And but what this research actually does, it goes further and says, yes, the ideal tenant may be a white 35-year-old male, but what happens then to others and those others if they don't fit in with that? And in this case, the whole sample was male entrepreneurs. So it really shed light on the experiences of men that were, say, non-traditional masculine men, or that didn't fit into this stereotype of the entrepreneur that is typically 35, white and male.
And what was it that you found with those minority groups? Like, what was the experience of those, let's say, minority groups in this context in those studies?
Yeah, so the traditional male or the traditional tenant, they referred to like the accelerator being like being on survival. They wanted to be on like a reality TV program, and they wanted, the survival of the fittest, and they were quite aggressive, and we're here to get venture capital, and they were very purposeful in terms of why they were in the accelerator. Those that didn't fit that characteristic or that category, they felt they wanted actually more emotional support from the accelerator. They also wanted more networking. They did enjoy the structure of the accelerator, but they also wanted more emotional support. And also then what's interesting then, they just felt that they didn't get the same sense of community because they did feel that they were different than the stereotypical tenant.
And did you find in the research that was embedded by, let's say, the mentors of these accelerators, the people who maybe were going to give the funding in time, they had in their mind what they were looking for? And it's this, as you've described, this kind of hustle culture, masculinity, we're willing to, do whatever it takes. When, in my experience, I find the other piece you mentioned around the kind of emotional support on that journey, I often find with entrepreneurs that are maybe a couple of years at it, that's the thing that probably really they struggle with, and that's what lets them down, is that they've not put the foundations in place in that area. And that can obviously then be detrimental to their business over time, their leadership style.
Well, the short answer is absolutely. The research actually showed that the accelerator managers really reinforced this culture, and some of them saw themselves as like whipping the individuals into line, for want of a better word or phrase, and was just trying to get them in line. And also they very much did reinforce this idea that it was a bit like a boot camp. And I suppose this is also, we hear these phrases, boot camp, and that's sort of where it really adds to it, and it magnifies then again as well.
And what do you think is the danger in that as well? Obviously, over time, there's no doubt it's going to marginalize female entrepreneurs, other people from minority groups, and we maybe won't have let's say, those role models for future generations to be able to look at if we don't obviously act on this. But I suppose from a wider context, what do you think is the danger in if we're not looking at those programs and making sure that they are, let's say, filling both sides rather than just focusing on those kind of, I don't want to say toxic masculinity, but in a way, we're seeing a lot of that now in society.
Yeah, for me, and I suppose my own personal philosophy, particularly with teaching, is to make entrepreneurship open for all. And that's very much what I'm driven by through my research, is looking at how other individuals that don't fit the stereotype engage and experience entrepreneurship. So I think it's incredibly important that we try to move away from the stereotypes. And I also do that with my teaching and trying to introduce students to different types of entrepreneurs and also different types of entrepreneurship as well, because one of the things that is also derived from the stereotype of the entrepreneur is the stereotypical venture. And I think what we're seeing now, particularly with the likes of social media and digital, we're seeing other forms of entrepreneurship. And we're also seeing other pathways that people can engage in entrepreneurship that previously they mightn't have been able to. So I think it's really important that we're always broadening how we see entrepreneurs, how we see entrepreneurship. And also we have space for that broadening, because the thing about stereotypes, they're really narrow and rigid.
As you're speaking there, I'm smiling as well, because as you're describing the different types of entrepreneurship, I'm thinking back to conversations I would have had in the past as I was growing my own business. And the idea of mentioning the word kind of lifestyle business to any of the people that I was engaging with, let's say as mentors, I nearly felt embarrassed and ashamed to say that what I'm trying to create here is the conventional lifestyle business, whatever that might mean, because it is a bit different, obviously, for everybody. But I nearly felt embarrassed and ashamed to say that, because I wasn't going for the stereotypical venture, let's say, that you've described.
And I think it's also important in terms of those real high growth businesses, and years ago they would have called them gazelles, or whether they call them unicorns. It's a very, very small percentage. It's a very small percentage, and the most small firms are going to be maybe lifestyle, or So I think this idea that all firms are going to be high growth and entrepreneurial is not really reflecting the reality as well. And again, I think it's really important, particularly for the likes of women as well, to look at different ways to be entrepreneurial, because there has been a lot of myths, and it has sort of come from the stereotypical normative type of business, that women's businesses are lifestyle, or they're based on their hobbies. So they're not as serious as others that maybe are high growth. But if we look at actually the figures, they look at the, I suppose, the income that they're generating, they are providing really good, as you say, lifestyles for these entrepreneurs. And the other thing is, it's really important to look at the characteristics and behaviors and the mindset. So if these individuals are being entrepreneurial, that should be also celebrated as well.
It's interesting, isn't it, how the definition of success, or the definition of an entrepreneur, because you've just described there for me what really sounds like success. These businesses where, yes, the revenue is good, they're sustainable, they're values based, they're but yet we don't necessarily look at a business like that. Well, I would obviously, from my background, but in society, we don't necessarily zone in on those businesses and say, no, that's a definition of success.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, because the normative business standards are, well, before COVID, for example, would be, a business that isn't based in the home, a business which is high growth, a business which is the key, I suppose, goals are profit maximization. Obviously, it's changed a little bit now more with home-based businesses, but that would have been the stereotype of the high growth business. And anything else that didn't fit into that was considered less than hobby, lifestyle, what have you. But I think it's really important to think about this word success. And I always, when any student would write this down, I always panic going, oh, be careful, be careful. Because for me, it's very subjective. Although if you look the likes of the research, and also if you look at policy documents around entrepreneurship, it's very objective. This is what success looks like
Yeah.
in terms of the size of the business and the revenue. But I think it's actually a combination of the both of them, that there's an objective element in terms of, yes, you can measure it in those ways. But if you talk to most entrepreneurs, it is much more subjective. And they will construe success through their values, as you talked about, but also and what's important to them. And lots of that is giving back, helping others, and also really having impact for their communities as well.
So would you say that our measurement of success for entrepreneurs is wrong? It needs to be revisited. We need to maybe give more attention and time to these other pieces that you've mentioned, giving back, being values-based. Do we need to redefine this idea of success in entrepreneurship and maybe press on that more in society?
Yeah, and there's definitely an emerging body of research that is looking at this, and I've done a little bit of research on this as well, and looking at how women can construe success differently. And it was a combination. There was obviously objective measures, because we all like to know how we're doing, but also then in terms of personal fulfillment, also then giving back. And I think most entrepreneurs that I've met want to help other entrepreneurs, don't they? Like they want to give back, and that's and also then all entrepreneurship for me is socially embedded, and as a result of that, entrepreneurs are deeply embedded in their local community. And that helps with their networks. It helps with this idea of what's important to them. And also then they also have a sense of helping that community.
Yeah. And I think another piece to mention as people are listening maybe is that when we're talking about, let's say, this masculinity that we've described at the start of our conversation, we're not necessarily saying that, males are over here, as a type of entrepreneur, and females are over here, because females can have some of these masculine tendencies, let's say, and how they operate. And as you've identified with your research, males can also be leaning more towards what we might traditionally say would be more feminine qualities. It's not necessary that we're saying males operate like this and females operate like this.
Definitely not. And I suppose the way I see it is that I suppose there is like a bucket of traits that we all have access to. And depending on the situation, depending on the context, we may dip into those at different times. So, sometimes we may need to be a bit more assertive. Other times then we need to be a bit more caring. So no, it's definitely, I think it's really important not to go into binaries or either or, because what happens then sometimes is that one is then considered better and less than. So I like to think of a bucket of traits that we can all dip into at different times, depending on the context.
And when you look at the journey of entrepreneurs, right, and I know you've looked specifically at female entrepreneurs in great detail as well, are there things that you see with female entrepreneurs that you maybe don't see in males that may potentially hold them back over time? The reason I ask is I've done quite a lot of work with female leaders, and there seems to be some commonalities in those groups that I'm not saying they're not present in male groups, but they're definitely more common in female groups from my experience working with leaders of obviously both genders.
Well, one thing that I have noticed, now it's not with all women entrepreneurs, because, as a qualitative researcher, we move away from treating everyone the same. And obviously there's nuances within the category of women, which I love researching. But I do see, I suppose, a common trend of that some women entrepreneurs are actually afraid to say, I am an entrepreneur. So if they're at a networking event, they're afraid to say, my name's Maura and I'm an entrepreneur. Or they might say, well, I'm working on a little project. Or, from the north, we say, oh, my wee business. So I've noticed that. And I don't know if you've seen something similar in the leadership sort of sphere.
Yeah, I would say absolutely. I think a lot of the programs, because obviously if you're delivering a program for an organization, you'll do quite a large part is discovery before the program even starts. And one thing that I've noticed across a number of different, let's say, female specific programs, is that self-belief comes up as a topic they want to have a focus on in the program time and time again. It's nearly like the number one thing that they nearly kind of zone in on is we want some work around self-belief. And it kind of sits with what you've described there.
Yeah, and I suppose then that actually has implications in entrepreneurship for legitimacy and credibility as an entrepreneur. Because there's research to say around this idea of identity, and we talk about entrepreneurial identity. So if you claim the entrepreneurial identity and say, I am an entrepreneur, you then need others then to grant that. So it's a two-way, I suppose, relationship. But if you're not able to say that, it may have then actual implications for your credibility, as well. So I do a little bit of coaching of women entrepreneurs, and I always encourage them, try it out, practice it, say I'm an entrepreneur, and and own it a little bit,
Yeah.
So that would be one area. And that's not all women, but there are some women that they, particularly when they're starting off and maybe transition from another career and still finding their feet a little bit.
Yeah, I think we were chatting a small bit about this beforehand as well. But I find as well language, like apologetic language sometimes. And as you've described there, if they can't step into that role and as you've said, kind of, I suppose, radiate confidence within that role, it does impact then what you've described, somebody granting them that, oh, you are an entrepreneur or you are a senior leader. If the language is somewhat apologetic around that, even though they've all the credentials, they've the experience, they have got the skill, it does then impact their ability to really, I suppose, step into that role fully, whether you're an entrepreneur or you're a senior female leader within an organization.
Yeah, and I suppose it just takes a little bit of practice, and it takes, trying it out, because I suppose it is another sort of persona, and we're trying it out. So, and just, thinking to yourself, well, okay, I'm going to a networking event. Again, I'm very introverted, and I've done a lot of research on networking. So I have a little few tips in terms of, that I would say to some of the women in terms of going to events if you are introverted, because networking is so important. But one of the things I would say is there's work in the word networking. So we think that some people are natural networkers, and some people are, but I think it's just thinking, well, okay, I'm going to this event. What is there any prep I can do beforehand? Who will be there? And then also maybe having a couple of lines in terms of like having your mini pitch about yourself. So if somebody says, well, who are you and what do you do? That you've got it and you've practiced it and you feel confident saying it.
It's actually such a good point, because I'd imagine even taking the time out to do that, I'm even just thinking of some of the people that I've worked with, and I could see them thinking, oh God, I couldn't give myself that time to, and it's not that they're like, they're very hardworking, right?
Yeah.
It's not for the want of doing the hard work, but they might even feel in a way a little bit guilty for actually carving out that time to perfect that pitch. Because again, it might come back to it's only my little business, my small business.
Yes, but then I always think practice makes perfect. And then also, particularly if you are a little bit nervous about these things, it's just giving yourself a little bit of confidence before you actually, you go to these events. And another thing that my partner sometimes does with me before I go to an event is we would say, you have to go and meet 3 people and have your photograph with 3 people. And this is difficult now, somebody who's introverted, but it just actually it makes the night actually quite fun then as well. So you're getting to meet people, you're getting to talk a little bit about yourself, and then also you have a photograph at the end of it as well.
And can I ask you, because you've obviously, referenced yourself there, like how have you managed to go from being someone who's relatively introverted, as you've said, to being that person who will do the work in the networking?
I suppose my research has shown how important networking is. And I was also brought up, my father had a pub in Banbridge, and I just seen that community social embeddedness. And I just think it's so important, particularly in terms of connecting with people, but also finding shared interests. And also that's how I've met some of my incredible co-authors, is through conferences and networking. So I wouldn't say I get really excited about networking events, or if I see the word networking, or if I see the word networking lunch, I'm like, goodness, can we do one thing or the other? But yeah, I just think the benefits of it, and we're all social beings at the end of the day. So I think I think we all have to, well, for me anyway, maybe I have to work a little bit harder at it, but I've had great benefits from it as well.
And I'm sure you've come across, obviously, the research from, I think, hopefully don't get the name wrong, but Mark Granovetter around your strong ties and your weak ties and how important they are.
Yeah, and because my PhD actually was sort of built around, the theory was built around that, and and it's so important because if we even, and I would get my students even to draw out their own network, and all of us have lots of family and friends in our network, but I would always say to them, just think about gossip. Like, what is the gossip? And they're like, and they're like, oh yeah, everybody knows that gossip. And I said, well, if you want new gossip, how do you get that? And they're like, oh, you have to get a new person into the network. And I'm like, well, that's your strength of weak ties then,
Yes.
and it's just important. It's just for the diversity as well. And then, that's obvious then when we think about also in industry and entrepreneurship, that diversity brings new ideas and new perspectives. And that's so important for keeping entrepreneurial spirit alive.
Yeah, because naturally we find ourselves in a vacuum, an echo chamber, and that's not a good place to be as an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
That can be, everybody talks about the entrepreneurial journey being a lonely journey. But I think one of the ways you can I've found anyway from my experience, one of the ways that you can offset that a little bit is having a good network of people that you can just regularly have that conversation, which is going to just shift your perspective on something.
Absolutely. And the other thing it's really important for, because first of all, they act as your role models and also act as your mentors. And, there's a lot of research to show that it's not just you have an individual mentor that is with you your whole career. Actually, having a group of mentors is really beneficial as well. But one of the things that mentors do for all individuals is build self-efficacy. And, self-efficacy for me is just that can-do attitude. I can do this. I can get through this challenge. I can get this sorted. And if you surround yourself with people that who you aspire to and are doing great things, you'll want to do great things as well. So I think obviously having people that you can share challenges with and emotional support, so important, but also there to inspire you and you inspire them as well. So I think networks and having your network is incredibly important for all of us, but particularly entrepreneurs, because actually my PhD really referred to networking as a particular entrepreneurial resource. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs don't actually see it as a resource, and it really is a resource. So I think if you started saying this is a resource, maybe the mindset towards it would change a lot.
Yeah, it's so interesting as well, because my dissertation that I did, I interviewed CEOs, some of which were entrepreneurs. So they obviously started the business themselves and then they grew the business. And I had a focus on what were the resources essentially that kind of helped you along the journey. And it's so interesting that you're talking about peers and network, because that was one of the things that came up in so many of the conversations. Now that they'd obviously reached, let's say, that level of their journey, or they had to be in that role or in a similar role, for over a decade, right? So there was kind of a criteria around that. But they all said, based on their experience, that was one of the things that acted as a key resource, having a strong network that they regularly engaged with.
And it's an intangible resource. I think sometimes because it's not that has the tangible aspects to it, but it's so incredibly important and has been very important in my career as well, because you've got emotional support. You've also got, access to new ideas and new opportunities. And so, yeah, I think that's fantastic that was mentioned.
Yeah, yeah. We often go back to, I like the I think it resonates with a lot of people as well that I would work with, the kind of job demands resources model, just as an example for them. And obviously you've got your resources, you've got your demand. So for me, I wanted to really try and explore for this population, and it was a mix of male and female CEOs, what were the common resources to help, I suppose, alleviate some of the impact of the demands. And yeah, it was mentioned on a number of occasions.
And also then what a lot of the research in entrepreneurship would show, that your requirements from your network change as you go through the business and the business develops. And it's probably the same then as you go through your professional career as well, that your, I suppose, the requirements and demands, because typically in entrepreneurship, when you're starting off, you will typically turn to your family and friends because that's your closest.
Which is not always the best thing to do.
But that's your closest. And then obviously when you, you grow the business and the business grows and has more requirements, then you might have more strategic and business networks. So there is a network evolution as you or your business evolves.
I'm just laughing because you said, you go to your family members, and I remember in the first few years of my business, I tell you, my mother would be cursing me because she'd be like, he's ringing me again. But ultimately at that stage, you were like, God, how am I going to figure this out? And you knew, like, if you were going to ring, that they would pick up, they would kind of listen to you. And it got to the stage, which I thought was brilliant. She stopped saying to me, why are you doing this? Why don't you just do something else? And then the conversation was nearly like, I'm going to allow you to have this time to think out loud. And I probably don't need to say much in this conversation, but I'm creating a space for you to actually just gain some perspective on this. But obviously, that was one, let's say, resource that I knew I needed to extend that. As good as that was for me, I needed to extend that out and have other men, as you said, a kind of group of mentors in a way.
But that probably was one of your first initial safe spaces to be able to say, well, this is what's happening, this is what's going on, and not feeling you're getting any judgment or anything, and also then just having that emotional space and emotional support is so important.
Yeah. I was 22 at the time, like 22, 23. So like very young to be dealing with payroll and making sure money's in on time to pay wages and chasing people if they weren't paying on time. And, I found myself very quickly going from, let's say I had a gym where client would come in, client would pay. We moved quite quickly into corporate well-being, which was a completely different ballgame, because now you're working with major companies who have payment terms of maybe 60 days. And this was something that was completely new to me. And now I had staff members at 22, and my focus is just, okay, how do I make sure there's enough money in the bank at the end of the month to pay everybody? And at the time, my go-to was, I have to pick up the phone. I need a little chat with my mother here to try and get me in the right headspace to get through this.
I think that's brilliant, just having that support, because that sounds like an incredibly steep learning curve.
It was. And now I ring, if for whatever reason we have similar problems, it's like water off a duck's back now. You faced it, you've overcome it. You know that, okay, this is how we're going to get through it.
And then that speaks to resilience, doesn't it? That you've been through the problem before, you've built up that muscle and that muscle memory. So it kicks in again, doesn't it, whenever you hit that similar type problem again?
Absolutely. And it's funny because you mentioned like self-efficacy and building that up over time. And that's something I would reference quite often as well. And obviously there's kind of the four elements, if you like. So you've got the role modeling piece. So being able to look at someone and be able to say, okay, yeah, I can kind of maybe get to that level, or I can follow what they're doing. There's then obviously as well the kind of mastery. As you're getting better, you get more confident.
Yes.
The other piece is then the piece I think that really fascinates me. The two other elements, obviously, which are how you manage your kind of physiological and your emotional states as you're faced with these difficulties. What strategies, what resources do you have to be able to, as we've kind of described in the last piece as well. And then the other piece, which I think is obviously part of this self-efficacy, is around recognition and getting recognition for good work, which I think as an entrepreneur, there's nobody generally there to pat you on the back. And there's always the objective data of, you look at the bank account, how well are you doing? It's there for you in black and white. But those two, I find, I'm just curious to ask you your experience with both of those, the kind of, and how important they are, the physiological, the emotional states, how entrepreneurs manage them, but then also how do they deal with the recognition piece, not having really many people to go, you're doing a great job, keep it going.
So one of my most disliked phrases is work-life balance.
Interesting.
Be interesting how would you think of that? Because, I don't think you could ever get a balance. And, but if I asked, and I've done this recently with some research, if I asked both male and female entrepreneurs, how is your work-life balance? What do you think they say?
Terrible.
Awful. Yes,
Yeah.
terrible, awful. What is that? We don't have that. And what's really interesting then, the majority of them would say, oh, I go on holidays, it comes with me, I'm still on the phone, I do my emails. They never switch off. And that's what they say. We never really switch off. My brain never really switches off. It's my business, it's my baby. And, I'm really bad at it. Maybe I'll get better at it. Maybe I'll get better at it sometime. But what we've noticed, we've been doing some research with younger entrepreneurs, and what we've noticed now is that they're really into like extreme sports, and also lots of long distance runners, and I think that's the way they're trying to switch off. They'll also say, oh, I can't completely switch off, but when I'm in the gym for an hour, or if I'm doing this, it takes me to another space or another place just for a little bit.
Yes.
So I think that's a newer trend. And a lot of younger entrepreneurs are talking about well-being, are talking more about, how do we look after our mental health? This is really stressful. I really love it. But if I want to sustain this, I need to also think about other ways that I can definitely not switch off, because they can't, but temporarily just get a little break from it as well. So that's definitely something I've seen in the last few years.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you, do you think that, that statement of I just can't switch off, right? Do you think that there's a potential danger there? Because and I'm sitting here saying, I run marathons, that's my outlet, right?
Yes, okay.
Right. But also there's the danger that if I'm constantly pushing my body and mind to that kind of level of stress, and obviously I know that there's a ton of mental health benefits to exercise, right? But is there a danger that if I have the mentality that I can never switch off and my outlet is extreme sports like we're describing, is there a danger that it does become this unsustainable, an entrepreneurial journey becomes quite unsustainable? Because if I'm not at that peak, and I can't oscillate between high intense energy and kind of full recovery, is there a danger that it just becomes unsustainable?
Well, I suppose the other thing I would say to you, if I said you're not allowed to run marathons, but you're going to read a book, would that do the same thing for you?
Well, I do read a book as well.
And you do read a book as well. But let me think, if you were going to do something a bit more...
And by the way, Maura, I've traveled, let's say I've traveled a long journey with getting consistent with things like reading, consistent with things like, reading for recovery and downtime, meditating for recovery and downtime. My natural go-to would always be, I'll go to the gym, I'll go and do a run, so it's certainly not, it's something I've had to work on. You're right. It's something I've had to work on for a long time, and it definitely didn't come easy to me, but I see the value in it now that I've been consistent with it, but it took me a good while to get there.
And I have a completely different career than you, but I have the same issues. And, I used to hear the word rest and recovery and think, what? Rest from what? So I have to work at that as well, and really sort of seeing that actually resting your brain is beneficial longer term. But yeah, and I suppose it's down to the individual. It's, if you love what you do, and it's bringing you joy and it's bringing you benefit. But obviously then when it gets to the stage where it becomes detrimental, there will be a time you have to make different choices. But I do think that entrepreneurs are high energy and that motivation, but trying to get some sort of balance, I think, is also important as well. But I think that comes with age.
Yeah, and actually you've kind of sparked another question to me there as you're speaking. I'm curious, have you done any research around, let's say, the life cycle of an entrepreneur and kind of longitudinally in terms of, because what we're talking about is let's say you've got these key areas of your life. You've got your health, you've got your relationships, you've got your career. And obviously as an entrepreneur, it's very easy for you to go extremely devoted to the career piece. So much so that I know personally that I've lost friendships because I was in my early 20s, I was very much zoned in on the career and my company. Have you done any research around, let's say, older entrepreneurs looking back on their careers and thinking, okay, I didn't invest enough time on my health. I didn't invest enough time in key relationships. I'm just, I suppose maybe I'm trying to get ahead of something here.
Well, I'm also just thinking about when you say life cycle, and I think particularly when I look at women entrepreneurs, a lot of them, their entrepreneurial journey has intersected with, their personal life. So getting married and having children. And I suppose in that way, they have engaged in entrepreneurship in different ways.
Yes.
And I suppose that's also the beauty for me of entrepreneurship. So I see, I always ask my students, what is your definition of entrepreneurship? And I just love it whenever they say it's starting a business, because I'm like, right, I'm going to get at this now, because for me it's much, much broader. And I like to move away from the idea that it's a noun and actually that it's a verb. Entrepreneuring, it's an act of doing.
Yes.
And as a result of that, it means then that you can engage with it at different times in your life, in different ways in your life as well. And I suppose that also then helps with, broadening out that stereotype, because that allows different forms of entrepreneurship and also different individuals and different ages as well. So I love this idea of it being an act of doing, and that we all can engage with it at different times and in different ways in our lives as well.
I really like how you've described it as entrepreneuring.
Yes.
Because as you're saying that, I'm picturing, maybe, and again, not to stereotype, but I just have good examples of this. Maybe a mother has a child, they're on maternity leave, they come up with a business idea, they set up a website within 2 days, and all of a sudden they're an entrepreneur. And maybe it's not the stereotypical what we would describe as an entrepreneur, but they are still an entrepreneur, and that's out there now for everybody. And by the way, it could be a dad who's on paternity leave and obviously is carrying, maybe more responsibility around the child aspect, but they can do exactly the same thing. Like it's not this thing where we have to, or we shouldn't think of it as this piece where I'm fully devoted to it. It's absolutely everything, and it's either going to sink or swim. There's so many more ways to look at what you've described, entrepreneuring, than just the conventional sense of the word that we might think, or the person we might picture when we think of an entrepreneur.
And for some reason, risk-taking has come into my head, because regardless of those different types, all of those individuals take a risk. Now, so I think the fact that they've decided to change something, to do something, that they've taken a risk. And I think that's really important as well. And lots of research has been looked at risk-taking propensity. And they say, well, if you have high levels of risk-taking propensity, then you are an entrepreneur. But more recent research has actually said that it's actually entrepreneurs see risk differently. So the perception informs the risk-taking. So I think that's also interesting as well. And I don't know if you can speak to that in terms of that you may see things as low risk, where others might actually see it as high risk.
Yeah, 100%. Okay. Like, yeah. And it's actually, I would love to hear more from you on that as well, because I think it goes without saying, obviously this is probably an obvious statement, that I think an entrepreneur doesn't see the problems, they see the opportunities. They see it as, whereas there's a lot of things that I could ream off a couple of things to you, and in a second, based on my life, right, that you would turn around and go, oh God, no, you shouldn't go in-house, work somewhere in-house. It's going to be far more secure for you. It's going to be, but then if I was to describe it to you the way I see it, you'd probably see it completely differently. And what I mean is, it's again, not focusing on the things as problems, but actually focusing on the opportunities and probably what I would say, really zoning in on the benefit of the value you get from being an entrepreneur. And what I mean is, I would meet friends and they would, if I haven't spoken to them in a while, the assumption and the first comments are always, how are you getting on? You're probably working every hour of the day. God, I don't know how you do it, right? And actually, they're relatively shocked when I turn around and I'm like, back to our work-life balance. When I turn around to them and I say, no, actually, it's going quite well at the moment. Work-life balance is good.
Yeah.
I'm able to switch off. I'm able to, and I think sometimes for me, it's about remembering those things that I have now, as much as I'm still trying to achieve more with the business. It's not forgetting the lifestyle it gives me now and how that lifestyle would be completely different if I was, let's say, working in-house doing what I'm doing. So I suppose, yeah, I've probably gone on a small bit of a tangent there.
Well, I think one of the reasons I love researching entrepreneurs, interviewing entrepreneurs, and working with entrepreneurs is that they always see opportunities. And I think it's really amazing in terms of the challenges. They see opportunities, they look for solutions, and that's really infectious. So so I think that's the first thing I would say, is that yes, most entrepreneurs that I have met are very solution opportunity focused. And that all goes back to problem solving and critical thinking and active doing. So I think that's, but in terms of, I think values is really important. And I don't know if there's enough research that actually has been done on that in entrepreneurship, and really this idea of being value driven. And what are your values? So I've done a little bit of coaching with entrepreneurs, and sometimes they really struggle of identifying what their values are, because they're like, oh, I want to do this and I'm doing this and I'm doing that. And these are my goals. And I'm like, but what are your values? And they're like, oh, I don't know what my values are, where others are very clear on what their values are. But I think it's really important to actually spend time thinking about what your values are, because they will inform your goals. So what you're saying is that your values of the way that you've actually created and established your business has helped you obviously achieve your goals, but has also created a lifestyle for you which is aligned with your core values. So that's why it all fits.
Yeah, you've articulated that really well, by the way.
Don't ask me to repeat.
But you're right. I'm reminded of a conversation that I had with a coaching client of mine who's a business owner. And this was very early on. He showed me the goals for the business for the following year. And in a way, he was shocked when I asked him, what is it about that goal that's really important to you?
Yeah.
And it was like he'd never given it enough thought. He'd obviously looked at it and gone, right, if I double the revenue, it's going to look good. It's going to showcase the business is performing. But it was the question, why is that goal important to you? And how does it align with you in your life at the moment? That really took him back a little bit. And then funny enough, when he went and he did a little bit of work on that, he was like, actually, that's not the goal. That's not the goal that's important at the moment, which was obviously a bit of a kind of breakthrough for him. But I'd imagine that's something that you probably see quite a lot.
Yeah. And also, I suppose goals and success are related in terms of if you've hit your goals, you are successful, whatever that means for you. And I suppose then it's important then for me that whenever you think about what your values are, you have a clear idea what they are. They will inform your goals. So the values are important because they can determine what you say yes to and what you say no to. And for me, they actually then create your boundaries. And a lot of the women that I would coach would actually say, I really find it hard to say no to things. And I said, well, if you're clear on your values, then that'll help you to say, well, okay, that doesn't align with my value, but that does. So also then values are really good with setting your priorities, not just your goals, but also your boundaries and your day-to-day priorities as well.
I think you're so right there. And I think that is something that for me over the years, I've tried to spend more time on making that as clear as possible. because like many business owners, I'm sure listening in, it's very easy to say yes to everything. You know, you'll always see, I always say like the shiny object syndrome. It's like,
Yeah.
that's an opportunity, that's an opportunity, that's an opportunity. But then when you are saying yes to everything, it's not long before you yourself are feeling the strain of that as well. Whereas I think the work that I've done personally on my own values has really helped me actually start to say no to things that may look like a good opportunity on the surface. But when you peel it back, you're like, actually, no, it's not. And you need to say no to this. And it's only, I think, a lot of the time when you're really clear on what those values are that you can start to do that.
Absolutely. And I think that's what I would say. Values are really important to determining your goals, but this idea of what you're going to say yes to and what you're going to say no to. And then I think when you say that to entrepreneurs, they get it because they know that they are time poor and they know they have to have some sort of filtering to determine what is really going to bring them joy, and also then what's going to be important in terms of, I suppose, aligning with their values.
And it can't just be the business that brings you joy. That's not a good strategy, I've found.
Well, I think it's probably a balance of everything, isn't it? And
Yeah.
I think also, and most of the entrepreneurs that I've interviewed will say, there's no such thing as work-life balance. Sometimes that the business is going to be like all consuming, and then other times the family is going to be. So I think it all goes in waves.
Yes. Last question for yourself. We always ask our guests to leave us with one lesson that they'd like to essentially give to the audience, give to the listeners. What's one lesson that you've learned more from your career that you would like to leave? And it could be to an entrepreneur, or it could just be to, we also have a lot of people working within organizations that would listen into this podcast.
For me, and I suppose again, it aligns with my values, and one of my values is giving back and helping others. And we talked a little bit during this about mentors and role models, and I've been very blessed to have some fantastic mentors and role models along my career. So one of my values is very much about helping young academics and young entrepreneurs. So that would be something, again, if those opportunities come in, I prioritize them because they align with my values. So I think giving back and service, that definitely brings me a lot of joy.
It's interesting. That's been a common theme today. We've done two podcasts today, and both have spoken about that as the kind of the final piece of information. So no, really great to have you on the Lead Well podcast, Maura, and thank you very much for your time.
All right. Thank you.